I'll wake up.
Hey, thanks. We are back. Dr. Danny, Chris Edmonds, the bro, the brain. I am excited for another episode on Monday.
Heck yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. I do want to tell you something really quick before you get started. So, I told you, I guess I'll just announce it here. I'm in the process of writing a program that'll get released on Mountain Dog Diet. And to start my back day on Thursday, I did that pull down that you showed me when you were in town of the one
Yeah.
that you kneel on the ground, right?
The half kneeling one.
Yes. So Chad's like, what do you call that? And I was like, I don't know what it's called, but I'm going to call it the Dr. Danny pull down. So
Ah,
I just
that's so
gave you an
funny.
exercise.
Sweet. I'll take it, man. I will take it.
My goal is to I'm going to shoot a bunch of YouTube videos around this program and things, and like I'm literally going to call it that. So that is a shout out to you. When the program
Thanks.
comes out, it's a really cool pull down. If you guys can envision this, like kneeling and then just pulling down, really supinating the wrist and just trashing that lower lat fiber. It's a great exercise.
Part of why that works so well is something that we can talk about with training today that we talked about with your back training and how going to a unilateral versus a bilateral movement. Basically takes that concept and takes it even one step further. So
Okay.
yeah, we can break that down too.
Okay, cool. So we are to give you guys a preview, we are going to go into all things back training because that was a huge request. I had 6 people reach out to me and say, "Hey, please continue to do this, and we want back next." So that's big. But if you guys haven't listened to Danny go on Dave Tate's podcast for Table Talk, I am almost 2.5 hours in, and it is jam-packed with information to start there. So
Thanks.
I put a note in my phone because I actually listened to it and then played it back to make sure I get it right. You I think David asked you, you guys were talking about like stance for squatting, stance for deadlifting, and like grip width for bench press. And he said, won't most people just settle into the stance of the grip that they're meant for? And to me, I thought that was a really powerful statement because a lot of times I'll tell people what feels the best, where are
Hmm.
you the most powerful, where you can you generate the most strength, right? And the amount of times John would program leg press or squats for me and write that, that was very easy for me to find. It's like for squats, it's like just like a touch outside of hip width, my toes at like 11 and 1. For bench, I know it's like if I take my hand on a bar and put like the knurling to start here, and then I just slide it a little bit past that, like I know I could find that really simply because I'd lifted so many weights at that point. What would you tell people, or is there something that you look for in either of those scenarios of squatting, deadlifting, or bench press that can help people who aren't maybe as body aware figure that out?
So it's interesting you brought up the table talk because I felt like I got to show about point 0.5. He kept talking about me and my process. I was like, I don't want to talk about me. Like, can we talk about how I help people? Can we talk about like the coaching aspect? Can we talk about the PT? Um, but like the very little that we did touch on, it's in that context, Dave knows me in the context of powerlifting. Like, yeah, he knows I'm a bodybuilder too, right? But um, I think it's important. I'm going to back this up a little bit. I work mostly with coaches. So when I'm working with coaches and they're like, hey, I have this person who I can't get to squat without pain or something like that. That's kind of where I come in and I start to do a little bit of teaching. And I have my handy dandy
Heck yeah.
model here. And I think what's important for people to understand, um, as I've talked about the rib cage, and I've talked a little bit about like a wider versus a narrow rib cage and what that does three-dimensionally to the structure. And very often there's an analog happening at the pelvis. And what's important to remember is that there are some people who live in a bias where they're really good. If this reorients here, they're going to pick up femoral interrotation,
Yeah.
which means they're going to be really, really good at hinging, right? People who live here are going to be better at squatting because their femurs are in a position of relative more external rotation. And if we layer on top of that, a lot of people have, let's say they're here, but they're also anteriorly tipped and rotated one direction.
Yeah.
That's often where I come in. But
Yeah.
um, the best thing that I think we can do is as coaches and as athletes, I'm going to try and make this very, very simple, is recognize that not everyone is going to be good at every movement.
Right.
And
Yeah.
our job is to find the ones that look most natural and figure out ways to increase the challenge. We're going to call those like movements you can really push, right? And then me, I'm a great example of someone who's not great at hinging. My hinge comes from my back. So I need to find a lot of movements that allow me to load that hinge and recapture some internal rotation, but not do it in a way that just drives more back extension.
Yeah.
So you get this kind of like this spectrum of what someone should be able to do. And in my opinion, the art of programming comes down to figuring out like how much do you want over here and how much do you want over here? And where do you want to do that physically? And when you start to push this, what happens to these? Do they increase intensity or do they decrease? Because very often they increase in intensity and people think they need to do the opposite. So, but that's really where like I think the art and a little bit of the nuance of things comes in.
Yes.
Um, I think with regards to upper body, just like there are going to be some people who are better at squatting and better at hinging with regards to their structure, there are some people who are going to be better in overhead plane of motion and others who are going to be better in, out here.
Right.
Um, and so I think again, just kind of recognizing that most of us know this, right? Like inherently we
Yeah.
know that,
Mhm.
some people are going to be better at overhead pressing just because their rib cage sits in a way where their scap can rotate up the way it needs to and get that last bit of extra rotation at the top, at the humerus, so they can get it full overhead. Other people don't have that. So it's not so much which do you want to use and not use, it's which do you want to push and which do you want to kind of nurture. And then
Right.
how do you structure those within a program? Does that make sense?
Yeah, without it. Because I think later on in that podcast, you guys were talking about like determining, or I think you had said most people know if they're better at squatting or deadlifting, right? And with zero knowledge of training within the first probably, I don't know, 2 months of bodybuilding, I knew that I was better at squatting than deadlifting because it just felt natural.
I'm going to add a layer to that.
Yeah, go.
Based on your structure, when we start a squat
Mhm,
here,
mhm.
you're actually better, you're more hinged than you are squatting. So you've used a hinge to open up range for a squat. Again, there's a lot that we could talk about with the
Right,
limb model and biomechanics and hip rotational demands and what has to happen to the shape of the pelvis.
right.
But even though you feel you are good at squatting, your structure, just pelvic structure, should be a little bit better in hinging. And when I've seen you squat, you actually access your hinge first to open up range so that you can use it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
capture your IR
right.
so that you have some external rotation space to move into. If you
Okay,
have external rotation, you can back off of that,
okay.
go the other direction into internal, and then kind of recapture it to come external to get that full arc.
See, that's so wild to me to think about because I've never looked at it that from a structure standpoint of how the joint operates, other than for me, honestly, just being like a shitty meathead thought process is like my quads are big, I'm good at squatting, I can move more weight, I have to be better at
Oh,
that.
there's a lot more to it than that. So there's
Right,
like talking about the idea of like the concentric and eccentric orientation. A lot of that has to do with the bias of the system through the pelvic inlet, pelvic outlet. But some people are just going to be better at contracting muscles than others because of the position of what's going on through here,
right,
depending on how this is shaped. I know that's like weird to throw up on YouTube, like, hey guys, use a pelvis, but I mean there's more to this. People just want to talk about anterior pelvic tilt, and I swear, if one more person asks me about anterior pelvic tilt, I'm gonna chuck pelvis out the window and just say I quit. But
I know this is going to probably send you down a rabbit hole that we don't necessarily need to go deep into. So maybe just a yes or a no.
okay.
Do you feel like that is more genetic, meaning how my hips and everything were developed? Or do you think that was more in terms of like what I did as a young athlete? Or did both of them play an equal part in that?
I don't know that I would call them equal, but I would say there's layers. There's your
Okay,
bone structure that you're born with, right?
right.
But then on top of that, there's a lot of movement that happens to that. And in any given point in time, people are going to adopt different strategies that help our nervous system reorganize.
Mhm,
And what your body is basically a representation of all the layers of reorganization that have happened in your nervous system
right.
for problem solving over the last how many years?
A lot. I've been
Yeah.
training since I was 13, so yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, when I get someone who's been training a long time, and I look at their structure and I appreciate, okay, well, based on their structure, here's the amount of range of motion they should have. I'm just going to talk hips because hips make more sense to me than shoulders do. here's what I know they should have. If they don't have that, what's the reason for it? And you can often look at training styles. You can look at, movement selection. You can look at things like execution. Those are all going to have big trickle down effects too.
Of course.
So,
Yeah.
the first thing I look at is not restoring them to like what a textbook would tell you is normal ranges. Like I know very people that are going to have like 70 total degrees of hip range of motion across internal external rotation.
Right.
Very few people, but based on their structure, what should they have? And if they don't have that, I'm going to give them that first, and then look to broaden that range the other direction, if that makes sense.
So, something else I've always been curious about is when I stopped competitive bodybuilding and begin a downsizing process, like I would assume that's almost I'm gonna have to relearn how to move again, right? Or will I have more range because there won't be as much tissue and shit to run into?
Probably not. You're probably going to run into your motor control for the last, your 40,
40
41,
on the dot. Yeah.
27 years of training. Your motor control has had to solve problems where you have passive structures that get in the way.
Okay.
So even when you downsize, beyond just reps on reps, your soft tissue and your collagen and your fascia has now laid down. People kind of forget it takes like 90 days for fascia to relay, for collagen to really relay. So you
Right.
think about like you might pick up like 3 degrees of motion,
Of
right?
course. Yeah.
And then over 90 days, your body has to learn to hold that. Then you might pick up another two. You
Oh,
need another 90 days for that, right? So it's very slow. And there are some things that can be fast. It's always a question of where the control is coming from, if it's actually lengthening the tissue, if you're just kind of like, blipping through parts on the range of motion, if that makes sense.
yes.
If you don't have all of this and you can just go, which is how most of us move, like overhead especially. So that's where how much how granular can you get with that is basically where you're going to want to go.
Of course.
Does that make sense?
It does to me, 1000%. Because I think a lot of times when I think before we move on to back here is like I think when I say things like that to people, like, oh, like on leg press, just pick the stance where you feel the most power, right? For
I
me, I
love that
know
solution.
it's going to be a touch off the bottom of the platform. It's going to be roughly hip width, and my toes are going to be a little bit out. I know that I can sink those deep. I know I can move a shitload of weight, and I'm going to feel my entire leg work. I think sadly most people just don't know that. Like instinctually,
Mhm.
they they almost question like, well, if my feet are lower, I'm supposed to get more quad. If it's higher, it's more glute and hamstring. Like if it's wider, it's more adductor. Yeah, okay, cool. Where are you the strongest? And like I don't really know. And I would say outside of experimentation, I don't know how to answer that for someone, you know?
I kind of think too that a lot of this comes down to if I had to give a system for this, I think
Yeah,
about like the archetypes, again, like wide versus narrow, and in general, if we're to layer on something on top of that, it's the idea of orientation. If you take a wide person who's very, very far oriented in front of them, like yourself, it's very easy to produce power. If you
right.
take a
Yes,
narrow person who's oriented so far forward, instead of getting power production, what happens to them is the whole rib cage, spine, and pelvis end up just kind of doing more of this. And it's really hard to feel powerful when you're basically made small. Does that make sense?
good God, yeah, yeah. I think you may have just started to touch on. Oh, God, I don't want to get on this rabbit hole, but I almost
I
am
do.
touching to it. All right, so a question I've had for a lot of people and this is what I've just seen through hard training people and through watching videos, right? Like, those people who can produce bar speed like a motherfucker and they make a bar click, right? That's something that came natural to me. No one had to teach me how to do that. It was like squat, deadlift, bench explosively, and I can make that bar click with a lot of weight. I've had other clients who were
I
equally as,
love that sound.
yeah, oh, it sounds so good,
Such
right?
a good sound.
I've had other clients who are equally as strong, but they can't produce that kind of force. I always assumed that was how they either genetic with like fiber type or they just never had to train in a space where they had to produce that much power output. Is there more to that?
Probably synchronicity of motor units and the ability to. So even if we think a rep looks exactly the same, it doesn't. There's always some variability between reps. And so the ability to produce force and basically find less wiggle room between reps and make them more and more similar.
Right.
Um, but I think it's probably synchronicity of motor units and how tightly packed you can get. And if you're starting open, you've got a lot of room to pack into. If you're starting packed, you can't pack more. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, I specifically I see that like with our older son when he weight trains, he can't produce that kind of force on a bar, right? And I, I've always been like, okay, bro, you just have to move it fucking fast. Like, control the negative, and then I need you to think about jumping through the ceiling or, pulling this like through your roof. You're trying to save someone's life, like, right? And I don't know if I had so much early iteration of like squatting against bands and chains that it forced that even more so. Um,
Well, think about it this way. I don't know how he's structurally put together, but if he's not structurally put together for a squat and he's being asked to squat, his body's going to reorganize all the joints in a way that he can, but is it going to allow for efficient movement, high synchronicity of motor units? Probably not.
right. Yeah. And
So
so
a lot of it comes
you
down to
talked about,
like,
sorry,
I don't
you
know, go
talked about
ahead.
being packed together. That is very much his structure. Then also he is, for lack of a better word, he is hyper mobile through his joints, which makes him really
Yeah.
good at wrestling, right? Because guys can like fold his shoulder behind his body where most people would tap and he's just cruising. Like the ref will call it a dangerous position before he's like, it hurts a little bit, but I'm good. Where if you put my
Yeah.
shoulder like that, it'd be dislocated.
He's never going to have high force, like high, he's never going to have that training quality that you
Got
have.
it. Right.
And
Yeah.
no matter how much he tries, and in fact, making him try harder is
Mhm.
probably going to put a wind up on his nervous system that just makes the whole movement worse.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay.
That's it. I think that's an important coaching point. Like we might want someone to be able to do something, but if
Yeah.
they're structurally and physiologically, and again, structure, we want to think about those are constraints, right? This is like the constraints of this is how their pelvis is put together. And then physiologically, we've got things like, rate coding, motor unit synchronicity, um, fiber types, I would say, are more physiologic than structural.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got the athlete psychology. And there's study after study after study that shows if we over cue or we give someone a thing to do and they can't do it, movement gets worse. Like
Right.
practice
Yes.
that thing worse.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, like again, like my heart is to just basically change the shape of, or be a small ripple of changing the shape of how we go about coaching bodybuilding and movement altogether, because we know more than we did 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
And if we do, well, then why are we not adjusting our training styles with it? And this doesn't mean, again, like you know me, this doesn't mean like don't train hard. This
Right.
is like if my blood chemistry is more limited in a delivery versus a utilization standpoint, how am I going to get more hard reps in?
Yeah.
Right? Am I going to do better with a cluster set or am I going to do better with a really hard set of 20 to 30? Because if we know what we're trying to develop, well then gosh, our like muscle growing just got really fun and really creative, right? And we're not just shooting darts at a board based on something that might be hard, but there's actually a purpose structure and structure to it.
Yes. That was an incredible 30 minutes.
Back
Uh,
training.
yes, yes, yes. I think to wrap that up, like, if anyone got anything from that as far as like just being a little bit more open-minded to your structure and if you're a coach, like training other people to where it's like you may be able to do this, but the client may not be able to. It's not transferable, not always. So
Hmm.
just being a little bit more open-minded because that's to me what I took away from that.
And this is the kind
Um,
of stuff that I talk about. I just launched that office hours
yeah.
basically because I've got people asking me all these questions, and I was like, okay, well, let's all talk about it together. So we all, instead of having 12 conversations, I'd like to have like one. So if people have questions about this stuff, jump on in. It's the kind of thing that I think is really important. Like, how do we start talking about these things and are not just a textbook? Like anyone who's taken the CSCS exam knows that that textbook was just, do
Yeah.
any of us see that? No. So.
You said something really powerful last week before we get on the back. Like you said, people who are alike tend to congregate together. So it's like if you
Mhm.
take like little Dave and I, we look very similarly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He's great at like throwing reps, like meaning like just popping weight off his chest, for example. A squat, he's gonna bury that bitch and then stand up with power. Like, so him and I like synchronize very well when training because we can make sets mirror each other very
Yeah.
congruently. Um, and I think sometimes maybe people might watch that and be like, well, fuck, I can't do that. I can't generate that kind of force against a load that's heavy. And what I would encourage people out there is don't get discouraged because as what you
There's a
just said,
reason.
your body may not benefit from that. And even if you could do it, it wouldn't work. It would just fuck you up even more. So,
I'll say I'm really jacked up because for years I tried to train like Dave.
oh,
Everywhere
okay.
we went, everywhere we went, Dave got all the praise from everybody. And I was like, well, clearly he's doing something right. I must be doing everything wrong. I got to do everything like him.
Right.
And so even though like I have this formal education and like this is what I do, I just made the assumption that he was doing something better. And it left me so jacked up, like so jacked up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're put together so differently. So, and I think that one last point,
Yes,
um,
please.
I'll kind of get off of this, is that there's an enormous interplay between our biomechanics and our structure and our physiology and things like CO2 tolerance and even like vagal windup and stuff like that. And so if we're going to try and get the most out of training, like this isn't just how are you put together from like a structure standpoint. This is like your whole system. Like you are one body and this stuff all works together. Someone who's narrow and has all that compression going on, they're going to feel their vagal windup in a very, very severe way, but it's going to take a long time for them to get there. Someone who is the opposite structure, they're not going to feel it as quick. They'll feel it quicker and it won't be as severe. And so that's part of why, like, part of this is important because as we train, obviously, we're building up the blood chemistry and changing all the hydrogen ion buildup and all the acidity that comes with that. And that influences vagal tone, which is ultimately going to influence our recovery. So we have to play into that.
Of course.
So it's not just try harder. There's literally your physiology is imprinted on your structure.
I love it. That was a perfect way to wrap that segment up. Only because I hate these fucking nerds that come into our space and tell us there's one way to do everything.
No, gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not. There's multiple ways. So, yeah. All right, back training. To me, it's logically to break it into three segments,
dig
like
it.
hinge or lower back, however you want to look at that, lats and upper back. Where do you want to start?
I'll leave that to you.
All right, can we save lats for the end? Because I think that's the most challenging for
Mhm,
most people. Um,
mhm.
I don't know. Do you see that? Like, you see a lot of people in the bodybuilding world, and I feel like lats may be one of the most underdeveloped muscles as a whole if I look at it across the board. I feel like it's lats and hamstrings. That's just an observation I've made over 20 years, by the way. I'm not saying there aren't people with freaky lats. Like Derek Lunsford's a perfect example. That shit hangs off the bone. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
I think as a majority of people that I see, amateur, high level pros down to high level national guys, the lats tend to be the most tricky. So, um, instead of finishing there, let's start there. Well, do you have a theory behind why that may be?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think a lot of it again has to do with most of our world is in front of us, and when we're so in front of all the time, our rib cage, the whole thing kind of gets shoved forward.
Okay.
And if that's happening, you're not going to get full length on that lat.
Okay.
If you can't get full length, you're not going to get full contraction, much less be able to really display it.
Okay.
Uh, I think that's part of it. I think the other part is I've wondered how much in the last couple of years the nuance of like how to train a muscle hard and keep the tension on the muscle, like you talked about last week with the chest. I think in the last couple of years there's been this like really weird fork in the road where people either train really hard or they're like, oh, I'm just gonna get a pump. And um, I think lat training probably requires all of it. Like back, in my opinion, requires a lot of heavy work. But if all you do is heavy work, you're going to end up with a lot of just concentrically oriented muscle that can't lengthen, and that length is what you need to show on stage.
So what's funny is I actually think there's three forks in that road. I think it's hard training, I think it's pump training, and then I think it's like pink dumbbells, pinky squeeze, let out at the speed of like a snail.
Yeah,
Because I feel like all three are get pushed from a different angle, right? Like you have like what I would consider like the most OGs. If you think like Ronnie, Branch, Johnny, like Jay,
yeah,
forefront of
yeah,
like bro, move heavy iron, T-bar rows, barbell rows, like basic dumbbell shit, and rip that thing like you're gonna like tear the world apart. And then I think the other side of that, you start to see people like John Jewett, for example, like be a little bit more precise with it, but it's still very purpose driven. And then I think people have branched off and they confuse what he's doing with like this hyper analytical, like
yeah.
like PT book. that you would teach an 80-year-old grandma how to do a machine row, right?
For sure. I think you're
Um,
nailing it.
and I think that no one knows where to go. They're like, well, these dudes have the muscle, John has the muscle, and then all these kids are telling me I'm a dumb fuck and I need to listen to them. Like, it's hard to delineate which of those paths to choose, right?
All right, one second.
I'll pull it up.
Three.
All right, we were back. Danny had a plumber issue.
Been a good day.
Yes. So I think what we were going down the track of like where to delineate, like where to take your training if you're someone out there looking in search of lats. Like, is there a common ground? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think you and I are both like, okay, well, these problems come up. What's the best way that we can solve them, right? Because you're going to
Yes.
get people that come to you that need a bigger back. I think everyone's feedback is trying to like get off stage. And if you're in a division that requires any amount of muscle, it's get a bigger back.
Correct. Yes.
But when you think about people that you've worked with that have had the greatest amount of progress, can you think of two like very, very different people?
Yes.
And can you think of what they've responded to?
Yes.
And has it been similar or different?
Very different.
I'd be really interested to hear about those two different case studies then.
Yeah, I sure can. All right. So Dave, little Dave, his back was used to be a huge liability. And I found what works best for him is he needs two different training days. We need a base heavy day where he rode a lot and was the goal was to move poundage, pick exercises that he connected to both physically but also loved mentally.
Mhm.
And the volume was relatively low. And then on the other side of that coin, later in the week, we did more pump and squeeze type shit where
Uh-huh.
he didn't go as bananas in terms of like pushing past failure, but the emphasis was on connecting to every inch of the motion, right? And
Yeah.
how I did that is a really cool structure. So it was a lot of supersets for a long time. I'd put him on a T-bar row, like chest supported. I'd make him squeeze his back. Like that was the sole purpose. And then we'd immediately go over to a T-bar row in the corner. And I'm like, okay, cool. Now take that same intensity, but I don't want you to hold the contraction. But I want to think about just contracting the back, let it out, contract it, let it out. And we took his whole back top to bottom and did that. And it was a lot of volume. It was like 30 sets.
Holy
So
crap.
day one was like 8 to 10. Day two was 30 and it was such different energy systems in terms of how he looked at the days, and it worked
Mhm.
really, really well. Um, then the other person that I instantly thought about was all I did was I simply took her back and I said, okay, I need to get you to think about it opening and shutting. And that's all I said. That's the only coaching cue I gave. I was like, when you get to length, it needs a length. When you get to short, you get to short. And I didn't go in as much detail with the supersets and shit. I just was really intelligent with picking exercises that when she sent me her form videos that she connected with. And I could see it in the video, right?
Yeah.
So I just literally took the exercises she could do well and then made her focus on those twice a week. So to me, those are very different approaches, but worked extremely well.
I think one question I would add more as a layer to that is like, did you find a difference in movement selection that they connected with?
Yes,
Like, yeah, okay.
without a
So
doubt.
like let's add that layer in too.
Yeah, so with Dave, he is very, very powerful. Like we just talked about this. He's very powerful and explosive. So choosing things like a barbell row, a Smith machine row, dumbbell rows, T-bar rows in the corner of where he could produce force. And then with the lady I'm thinking about, it was very much like leaning into a chest supported, like things that were chest supported, so she could like open her back and then fully shorten it. So the movement selections there were she had more like pull-ups. Um, she had more chest supported rows. She had double arm dumbbell rows because it was like able to lengthen and then get those elbows real far behind her. Where Dave kind of struggles
Mhm.
where I do is like getting those elbows way back and getting a hard contraction. She had a lot more movement and range of motion through her shoulder. So if you look at those as a whole, like we did more like straight arm pull downs, lat pull downs, pull ups, chest supported rowing, seated cable rows, things like that.
So for the gal that you're talking about, I mean, to me, it sounds like you're doing a lot of movements that are really letting her own that eccentric and get really granular with it.
Correct. Yes.
And with Dave, it's more about, can you really find both bookends? Can you find full length and can you find full contraction?
Right. And still move
So
weight. Yeah.
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 So for one person, you're looking at like, can you do this, right? And make it heavy. And for the other person, it's like, how granular can you get here?
Yes.
Um, and I think that that's a great example again of like, if they're the two people I'm thinking of, um, again, like different structural archetypes. What about things like a row versus a pull down? Did you find that some people they have an easier job getting into a vertical movement versus a horizontal?
Yes. And I always have wondered that, like, is that due to shoulder issues and restrictions? Um, or just a matter of like how they're able to keep posture within a pull down versus a row. Because to me, those are two different feelings when I do them. I don't know how they are for you, but that posture is, I almost feel rowing significantly better than I do pull downs or pull ups, where I have to focus a lot more on pull downs to find my lats. If we're still stay on
Mm-hmm.
the mat, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Also really consistent with like the structural stuff, which is cool. Again, like I'm thinking the wide versus narrow. I mean, what's really cool is like without knowing, you basically like gave all the information that like it kind of confirmed what these types are good at versus not great at, which is
Correct.
cool,
Yes.
really cool.
Yes.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think that when we think about developing, it's always about like how much life can you find so that you can shorten it, right? Like hypertrophy, if we're talking about it, that's the name of the game. Is
Yes.
like how granular can you get? And some people have an easier time doing that, and they're just mass monsters. And if you give them length, they're gonna rip it apart.
Yep.
And other people are more like the gal, and they're gonna have a little bit of a difficult time just using that grip and rip like and connection mentality. Um, so. I mean, it sounds like we probably approach this pretty similarly in terms of like just what we're looking for with people and how we structure things. And I think my question would be, a lot of people that I work with will say, well, oh, I can't find it. You know, it's not there. And my response to that is usually like, you've done like two sets. Like you're going to need to get really good at a movement over like 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And then you want to milk that for a long time.
Yes.
So like when do you like ditch a movement or modify it or, give a different, I don't know, I don't want to say like intensifier, but a different qualitative thing, like, maybe on the fifth rep, you hold that concentric before you let it out kind of thing, versus when do you just tell people like, I understand, you're gonna need to practice it.
So, okay, here's the funny thing. With back, I feel like it's almost a little bit different. You know what? I could almost compare this to legs a little bit. I feel like back is such a big body part, it's hard to do in one day properly if it's lagging. You know what I
I
mean? Like,
totally
very
agree.
similar to if I have a guy or a girl come to me and they're like, Chris, my lower body is way underdeveloped as a whole. I'll put them 2 leg days in there, right? Because it's like I can focus on like quads and adductors, and the next day I'll focus on hamstrings and glutes. And that segment is a lot less stressful in the whole system as I'm trying to bang it all in one day.
Yeah,
I, with people that have a lagging back, I tend to like it twice a week because it's what you're talking about. I can get volume over the course of the week and not just all in one session where the second half of that first, like if you're just gonna do one, the second half of the session, you're battling fatigue the whole fucking time,
for sure.
you know? And that's how I think about it. Like the fresher I am on a back day, the better I can connect to it. By the end, I found a lot of people like they're just trying to get through the session. And I don't want that. If you can't connect with it, the worst thing I can do is say, here's your workout. And the next thing you know, they're pulling with all biceps and traps by the end because they're just tired.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
think,
go ahead, yeah.
no, 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 go ahead.
The other thing I think about that too is if a muscle is small, weak, and underdeveloped, it's going to be hard to stay on it through a long-term session if the volume is high because it's not big or strong or powerful.
Right.
That's logic to me.
And like, if we're gonna add another layer to that, with regards to bringing up laggy parts,
Yeah.
uh, how well we connect to that muscle. And I think one kind of case for multiple training sessions per week beyond what you've already mentioned is there's a lot of important stuff that happens when that mind muscle connection is developed. When our somatosensory cortex can actually start to say, okay, yes, I actually do feel my lat.
Mm.
Like, do I think people need to feel their lat on every single movement they do, on every rep or assigned or go? Of course not.
Right. Yeah.
When I'm not gonna lie, I went years without feeling my lats at all, and was always told my back is one of my stronger parts.
It is.
Great. Clearly, we're doing something. Um, but I do think there's a lot to be said for every good rep that you get, the more you're able to actually change the brain's perception of that. So we have one portion of our brain that's really, really, its entire purpose is to basically help improve our ability to feel and talk to different muscles.
Yes.
Um, and the way we develop that is by using it. And so a lot of times getting that second day in, even if that, let's say you've got two sessions and the first session about halfway through, you're like, okay, my back is cooked. I'm gonna have to move on to rear delts and biceps or calf work or something.
Yeah.
Not that anyone do calf work, it's secondary. Um, that's still incredibly beneficial, even if you don't feel like you got that much high quality work in, because we have to think about the subsystems involved in actually growing the muscle. And one of those subsystems involved is having a neural system that's actually efficient. You don't find that efficiency until you actually change the somatosensory cortex to actually improve proprioception. We have a lot of stuff that contributes to that. One of my favorite cues that I've been using lately is to think about, especially on the eccentric row, going top down
Yes.
kind of really letting that fascia open up. I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago. Think about fascia as just this like passive like white tissue, like in between the meat. But it's highly, highly, highly innervated. What that means is there are a ton of nerves, ton of receptors, things like that that actually change our movement. It's part of why that's how a lot of things like massage guns and foam rolling and stuff like that work. It's not the mechanical change in the area. It's the fact that we're putting input into all the sensory organs within the fascia, the nerves, things like that. So if we can go top down, even if it's not super heavy, and you create a change in a lot of the passive tissue, not passive, a lot of the tissue in the area, you're going to get downstream effect over the next, again, like I said, 90 days for a lot of tissue to remodel. It takes time,
Yes.
but it will. That's part of why I think people need to be more okay with taking a training walk and running it for
Yeah.
6 weeks.
Right. So there's three things that came to mind. I need to answer your question first, as you asked me about how long do I leave a movement
Yeah.
before ditching it? 8 to 12 weeks. Unless,
Yeah.
let me pull it back. Unless you send me three videos of her in a row and you still look terrible at it, I might scrap it a touch early.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if it's not improving at all.
Right. If I'm getting no more either range of motion or contraction or movement, or I'm a big fan of if I can't see the muscle working, is it working? Like
Totally. Yeah.
that's something that's big to me. So if I can't see it stretch and shorten, is it working? In my mind, no, it's not. Um, so that's to kind of answer your question. Something else that kind of came to my mind. There was two parts of this. So anytime I've had someone struggle to connect with their back, especially in a prep, here's a fun little thing that I have them do. The last 20 minutes of your cardio, I'll have you drink some Vasoblast, which is a granite non-stim pre-workout. And then immediately after you finish your cardio, do a little bit of abs, and then go over and do like band assisted pull-ups with a neutral grip. And it was the form I was telling you about, like right before we jumped on or I hit record. So it's like chest tall, sit the elbow on top of the rib cage or the tricep on top of the rib cage, and do like 3 sets of 8 to 10, nothing to failure, with the sole intent of that 24 to 30 reps being just filling your back open up and then shorten, open and shorten. And I'll do that 4 days a week. And how I got that was one of my very old training partners. Sadly, he's passed away. He died in a motorcycle accident. He was an incredible, he was an Olympic gymnast. He had the biggest sweeping lats of a dude who had no business to be on a bodybuilding stage.
You're like, bro.
Oh, I mean, the meat on his lats. So one day I was like, Ryan, like, how did you get that? Like, and he's like, man, he's like, I swear to you, he's like, you used to come hang out with me at the gymnastics studio. He's like, just hanging from fucking bars and rings. He said, I'm telling you, that's why my back looks the way it does.
Oh, for sure. Well, and that's like the loaded DC stretching too. I mean, and we've got,
Yeah.
if people really want to cite studies, like, yeah, okay, they're on pigeons, but like whatever, like there's still a lot to be said for that. And I think most of us, when we sit, most of us sit a lot during the day. And the net effect of what happens with that is we lose the last bit of rotation required to get overhead for both scapular rotation and just to get like the rest of that humeral motion. And so getting into that motion, as much as we might get there by cheating, being able to stay there I think is like, again, there's our bodies are so adaptable. So it drives me crazy when I see, I get on social media and someone's like, oh, well, if you don't have the motion, you shouldn't do it. I'm like, okay, well, yes, in certain circumstances, but like, I don't know. I think for most of us that have any appreciable amount of muscle, like if we only use the range that we have, like our range is going to get worse and worse by the year.
Well, it's going to shorten. Heck yeah.
Right. Right. So we have to find a way to intelligently get into a position without necessarily hanging on passive structures that are going to contribute to, potential pain or pathology later on.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look there, what I did to someone, if I made them do, 24 to 30 reps of pull-ups in addition to their normal back work, it's just re-stimulating that. Like it's clicking in their brain, like, hey, how do I connect to that muscle? So to me, that logically made a lot of sense. Um,
100%.
Something else I wanted to talk to you about, and this is in specific because you got to watch it in real time with your Dave. When he started doing those step forward rows, the progression not only in tissue, but his ability to move that weight each week, you could watch like get better. So I think that kind of tied into the question you asked of like, how long do you leave a movement in if it doesn't look good? Well, you would probably argue week one, it didn't look incredible, but he was progressing so well with that, not only in execution, but I was watching his back get better at moving that weight.
That movement, as much as you give me like the Dr. Denny pull down, like that Edmonds row, all my clients love and hate that now.
And you know what's weird about that is it feels so awkward when you first do it because it's so against like anyone who's ever dumbbell rode what I would consider like the traditional way. They have a
Yeah.
hard time switching their feet. They feel uncoordinated.
Sorry.
So if you think about that movement with him, like watching that progression is kind of how I would expect a lift to go if you leave it in week after week and you adjust to it and adapt to it, right? Like I because you don't like it, right? Personally.
It depends. I
Oh,
mean,
okay. Okay.
it depends on how jacked up I am. If I'm really jacked up, I love it.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
I'm moving the way that I should be, it's not a good one for me.
Correct. Right. Yeah. And, that's so funny. I'm glad that you talked about that, about like, when you guys were powerlifting, what worked for him didn't work for you and vice versa, right? Because I think anyone could have watched his progression from like a macro level and be like, that's the back movement. Everyone should do it. Right.
He kind of has that effect on like almost every movement he does. Like you watch any of his training videos, and he's really good at picking movements that work for where he's good at moving in space.
Right. Yeah. You see, where I also see that with him a lot is that really bent over T-bar row with the wide grip.
Oh, and see, I hate that one for him. I don't think he gets nearly enough length on there.
Oh, I guess I'm talking more about like how you can watch him shorten that back like aggressively.
Um,
That's what
yeah,
I like watching him doing that. But no, I definitely see where, because I guess in my mind with that, he's all about just moving load, and that's like thickening erector, like density to the back, where then he'll go to what like that neutral grip prime row where it really opens up, or at least that's what I see on the outside looking in. So
yeah.
yeah,
There's and like I don't want to like he's unique too because he has so much tissue. Like you and I were talking last week, where like he doesn't need to be any bigger. He's 310 pounds with abs. Like he's big boy. We just need to get his gut under control. And unfortunately, what throws off his back from being able to be shown on stage is the same thing that throws his gut forward. And it's if you take the ribs and you literally do this, everything on the back shortens. And if you can't get it to lengthen, it's like doesn't matter how much tissue you have, you're not going to be able to open that up in a real lat spread. Your back double is going to look shallow. Um, I'm trying to take a little bit different approach with his training now. But he's really good at finding movements that he can move well into the space. And I think that's probably one of the big prerequisites of like, what's a good back training movement for you? We've talked about that you need probably some heavy things. You probably also need some things that are like more pump oriented, and you probably need some like, detail movements, just because
yeah,
those small detailed movements are going to open up the smaller ranges of motion that you don't necessarily have access to with the heavier loads.
yeah.
Um,
Could we go there next? Like, so
yeah.
you take his structure and your structure and like lay out what a not what ideal might be the right words, like of four upper back exercises and then like one lower back exercise. Like, would
I'm
you?
going to do one different. I'm going to say, let's talk about the movements, but talk about
Yeah.
how we do them differently.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, heck yeah.
Pick a movement and we'll go with it.
We'll start with a lat pull down.
So he's going to do really, really well with knee up because that's going to put him in a position to where before we got on this call or before we hit record, we were talking about how for you, it's felt really good to take more unilateral movements.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
part of the reason for that is generally the longer we train, our range of motion kind of decreases. The more constraints you put on the system, the less of that range you're going to be able to use, right? So constraint meaning two arms, you're going to have less range available than if you just go one arm and you let a little bit of cheat happen to pick up the relative motion to allow scap to move, to allow the humerus to move in the scap, to allow all the ribs to move on each other. I mean, there's a lot of mobility required for that.
Yes.
Um, so what movement were we going to talk about?
Lat
Pull
pull
down.
down. Yes.
Okay, so when we're going to the one knee up, part
Mhm.
of what we're doing with that is also increasing the degrees of freedom of relative motion.
Right.
So for someone who doesn't have a lot of motion, it's kind of like, where can we turn you the opposite direction so you have space to move into? Going to that
Okay.
one knee is going to put them in a bias that allows more range to happen.
Correct.
Whereas for me, I actually want to go the opposite direction, just based on my hip mobility and where I'm stable, how I can create pressure, things like that.
Mhm.
And then on the execution, I'm probably going to do a little bit more loaded stretch because it's a range that I can get into and is actually good for me from like I don't want to say like PT therapeutic standpoint, but it offsets a lot of other compressive training that I would do in a session. So I may do that later in a session.
Okay. Yeah.
Whereas for someone like Dave, he may want to do that earlier in a session.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All
Does
right.
that
So
make sense?
yeah, 1000%. So if you go there from to like a free weight row, what would be the difference in exercise selection or execution?
Um, so let's go with the prime extreme row, just because Dave
Yes.
and I are both using that now.
Perfect. Yeah.
So Dave is one where he can load that sucker up, and especially if he wants to do some sort of mechanical drop set where as he goes through his sets, he's loading more of that length and range.
Yes.
This is the front, this is the back. He can sustain this kind of squeezing, pushing down on him because
Mhm.
he's already there.
Right.
So for him, there's not much compromise there. He can load that sucker up, but he might want to open up his lats and improve proprioception before he goes there.
Okay. Yeah.
For me, I actually need to do a little bit more kind of loading through the mid-range as I fatigue, because I'm already squeezed front to back as a more narrow structure, and too much compression there is one of those things that'll influence things like vagal tone significantly. So once I train that really heavy, I'm going to want to use something that's more overhead to kind of offload that, open it up. Still hard. I'm
Right.
still probably going to do some variation of like a rest pause or muscle round or something,
Right.
but it's for a different purpose.
And then do you guys both take the same grip on that machine?
Yeah.
In the exact so if that neutral handle, you both go to the bottom, to the middle, to the top. Which one?
I don't know where he puts his hands.
Okay.
I will silently go, I go where I can reach, basically.
Oh.
I think one thing that we could talk about would be the degree of chest support.
Yeah, okay,
Um,
yeah.
the more Dave could probably stand to have it more horizontal because
Okay.
he's more able to withstand that front to back compression. So a
Right.
lot of people, if you start doing a lot of chest supported rowing, you're going to notice their sternum just kind of depresses rather
Mm,
than actually getting length through their back.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And the more and more you just get sternal depression, that's what's going to jack up shoulders and make it hard to get shoulder development and also basically down the line make it hard to get overhead.
Oh, yeah. Now, do you guys from there, after doing that row, do you both go double row back to back, or do you go into a pull down?
I will go pull down
Yeah.
again to like offset the fact that like me being super compressed is the worst thing I can do
Right.
for any of me. So I'm going to go to pull down to get things open up. I'm going to go unilateral because it's going to allow me to create some side to side lateral pressure to kind of recalibrate the nervous system, recalibrate vagal tone, and just allow me to connect better and put more load on the muscle where I want it.
Mhm.
Um, Dave would probably he'd probably go to a heavier loaded pull down with more of an emphasis on the concentric than eccentric.
Okay. Yep.
Does that make sense?
It does. Now, I will
So
pause.
for
Is he
So
up?
what's cool again is like this basically mimics what you were talking about with little Dave earlier,
Yeah.
where like, the other gal you were talking about needed a lot more eccentrically oriented movements.
Yep.
Obviously, like concentrics where you feel the tension.
Yes.
But Dave needed to be able to really get in that shortened position.
Right. So I'll put a pause on the exercise now. Do your reps mirror the same speed, both negative and positive, or do you guys have a different execution style within the rep for
I think
back?
I think it depends on the movement.
Okay.
We have different execution styles on just about everything.
Okay.
Um, one of us is better at absorbing force. That would be Dave. And if he can absorb and produce, he's going to be able to have a better contraction quality. This is like when people watch you train, are like, why can't I just throw that bar off my chest like Chris?
Right.
It's the same concept.
Yes.
I
You know,
think.
I asked you that only because, listen, you've seen me train in person and on video, obviously. That power makes that muscle for me just go. You know what I mean? Like it's if I try to get too cute with it, then my biceps and traps take over. Like
Mhm.
I can't, that's like really hyper slow, meaning, the positive portion of the repetition steals from the target muscle if I try to get too cute with an exercise.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
One thing I've seen with a lot of people, I think people assume that most men have this wider structure, and that's not true. I actually work with quite a few men who do not, and they do need to take a little bit of a different cadence, a little bit of a different tempo, because if they focus on like pure force production, they oftentimes can't load it heavy enough, so they end up just spending a lot of time in the short range.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
watch people like do reps and like they'll do a pull down, and it's just,
Yeah.
and I'm like, you need to put tension on that muscle and keep it on the muscle, like you talked about last week, same thing.
Yeah. I think I learned like watching Dusty Henshaw do anything back related of
I
like
love
just
watching
how
him
he just
train.
yeah, it's cool to watch because I relate to that, right? And I think you hear him talk about it because that's easily one of his best body parts, and it's like, man, you just got to rip that shit.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I think there's a good group of guys out there right now and girls not getting maximal results because they're falling into this camp of too cute. And like you and I said repeatedly for this podcast is like, there can be some exercises within a given session that has that, and there be other times where you slow down a little bit. So,
Well, I think the bigger thing to think about this, if I could lend just a little bit of insight in terms of when do you want the big force production versus when do you want to be a little cute with it?
yes,
The more force production you're asking for, you're going to get really big superficial muscles. Really,
yes,
really big. Which means that you're not going to get that same granular range of like, it's not going to be full range of motion. You're not going to get full scapular adduction because you're going to have so much global irradiation that you
yeah,
can't find.
yes,
And so I think one of the benefit of some of these like smaller cutesy exercises is that you are going to be able to get more of that fine tune range. And so it's a good opportunity to put them in. And like, I just brought someone on who was working with another coach who was having him do a bunch of like, behind the neck pull downs for detail. And there are parts of that I actually agree with him, parts of it where I'm like, okay. Mostly I said, okay, no. But I also was like, okay, no, I think there's something to this, right? Because that position is going to force you to lighten the load. And
right.
if you're lightening the load, you're probably going to get better neural control because you're not getting so much superficial overflow neurologically.
Like for example, to me, I think an exercise like a dumbbell pullover, I'm never going to do explosively.
Right. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense to do it fast unless you want to blow your shoulders off. Like,
Yeah. And I mean, the more superficial muscle involvement we have too, the less range of motion we're going to have access to. So the behind the neck pull down is a great example because for us to move into that position and even find it, we're going to have to let go of muscles we don't need in
right.
order to get there. And a
Yes.
lot of times, letting go of what we don't need is the biggest component of actually finding what we do.
Agreed. Yeah.
It's like we've talked about when you're coaching kids and you're coaching teams. There's probably always that one kid that wants to be on every play, and you're gonna be like, "Bro, let someone else have the ball." Like just once.
Yeah. All right. So to wrap up that exercise for both you and Dave, w would you choose different lower back exercises like a rack pull, a deadlift, a RDL, hyperextension? What thought process goes into that for you?
I'm gonna look at eccentric versus concentric orientation of the muscle at rest. Like, what's that muscle doing at rest on the person?
Yeah.
I'm going to look at what degree of sacral orientation and counter orientation they have, what's going on with pelvis structure, because ultimately that's going to help us determine can they even hinge. If they can't, then we probably want to go with like a very light reverse hyper and be very hyper specific on execution.
Right.
Um, I mean, my bias. I think picking heavy things up off the floor is one of the best things we can do for thickness and just density and an overall well-developed posterior chain.
Agreed.
a lot of people don't have, myself included, we don't have the requisite relative motion through sacrum, pelvis, hips, rib cage to find that. So I think erector training is is one of the areas that has the highest potential for a training tax that's not favorable
Agreed.
if we're
Yeah.
not smart about it. I don't think most people need to train their erectors and get like a massive low back pump. A lot of people do really poorly with that. Um, some people do better. And I could, if I had, you've seen the app I use, right? Where I like add all the different muscles and whatnot.
Yes, I love it.
I could show you why. That might be a different day,
Right.
but I'd be really interested, like when you see people in general who, like for myself, I hate erector training because it just jacks me up. But I also know that you worked with people over 20 years now who probably had a feeling like mine. How did you navigate that?
Very strategic. Now, what I say with that is I always loved pairing erectors with abs. So it's a yin and a yang there, right?
Hmm.
Because if you get too much blood into your erectors, as you know, anyone gets fucked, right?
Yeah.
You're stuck in this like old man position, like, and I'll give you a hard example. Early in John's programming, he would have me do banded hypers until you couldn't go 1 inch. Okay. If you did that with the intensity that I take, me and my training partners, I'm telling you, it would cripple us. You couldn't even walk right.
Yeah, no, there's no way.
There's no driving home after that. It's you better sit down because your erectors are spasming and you can't function, right? It's very similar to I ran this program once where I really wanted to thicken my erectors, so I was supersetting rack pulls, deadlifts from the ground, and hyperextensions like bang, bang, bang. Stupid as shit. Like not smart. I wouldn't recommend that again. Like in
But
my
you gotta make that mistake to feel it.
yeah, listen, you were there was no doubt your erectors were working.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that like if you are susceptible to what I consider like that crippling lower back pump, you have to pick and choose when and where to do it, right? So I'm going
Yeah.
to limit volume, and I like to get sneaky with it. So I'll do what I would have them do at the end of their back day would be 2 sets, 3 sets, maybe reverse hyper, higher reps, like 20 to 25. Then on their leg day, their final exercise of the day would be a barbell or dumbbell RDL, where we keep all the tension. I'd I'd tell them I'd want to keep it all in the hamstring, but if you do that, you don't get a break of the erector, right? Because you're always not coming to full like extension.
Right.
So you get a ton of erector work through that RDL. So if you do 3 sets of, progressively moving up in weight, let's say your top end range is going to be 8 for a hard set. I'm getting double erector work, but you aren't getting crippled with
Yeah.
pump.
Yeah. That's a
So
great solution. I
that's
dig
how I
it.
would do it, honestly. I also like, have you ever seen Louis Simmons teach a seated dumbbell good morning?
No, I'm not gonna lie. I do not consume a lot of content.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll have to send you that just to try it for sole point of anyone you have with a back injury that needs to rehab it. It feels absolutely incredible. You can't go heavy with it. It really. So what you do is you just like bear hug a dumbbell, and like for me to give you an example, I use 50 pounds, so not a lot of
Yeah,
weight.
I would just visualize someone holding a med ball, basically.
Correct. So then you fold your body as far as you can go through the hip, right? Obviously my range is garbage.
No,
Um,
yours is probably better than most people's, actually. It's probably
oh,
why it's good for you.
okay. And then when you come up, you really posture up in that contraction of your upper erector, like to where it connects to your low trap, is nasty. So when you're going down, coming out of the hole, it's all like low into the glute. And then as you come and then really posture up, it crushes your upper erector. Um,
I'm just visualizing hitting a back relaxed with that now.
yes. So another cool thing that I learned from John and Dave Tate was now, listen, they pulled this off the website because the probability for injury is very high. But we would take a yoke bar with not a lot of weight, like 2 plates aside. And then you would just hunch and extend, like hunch, extend. That would, I'm telling you, if you've never done that, it's an incredible sensation. Now, if you're watching this and have never tried it, please God, don't go put two plates on a yoke bar and try that. Um,
No, I'm trying not to nerd out and take us down a rabbit hole in terms of why or why not.
right,
We can do that another day.
right. I guess that was a long-winded answer to tell you like how I work around erector, where erector work would shut down your session. If you start to feel that come on, I like a combo. I have no idea why this works, but a combo of abduction, like the abductor machine for sets of 20, into hanging from a pull-up bar to decompress the spine, and then doing hanging leg raises off of that. So you would go 20 abduction, 20-second hang on a pull-up bar, and then immediately go into leg raises for a set of 15. That loosens up my lower back like that.
If you were put together more narrow,
Mhm.
swap abduction to adduction.
Oh, hell yeah. Okay, perfect.
And swap the hanging leg raises to the decline rope reverse crunch
Oh,
that you showed
perfect.
me.
Yes. Yeah. That's a really amazing ab exercise, by the way, if and no
That's
one.
one of my favorites. There's so much going on with that. I saw another clinician talking about that, and I was like, you have no idea how many bodybuilders need to see what you just wrote down. But yeah,
That listen, if I
just
get
like getting like posterior expansion through the rib cage, which is our ability to vacuum and do pretty much everything.
right.
That movement is so good for finding that posterior expansion if you can couple inhalation mechanics onto where you want it with the movement.
Yes. I think the final thing to finish this piece up with that we didn't touch on is those weighted stretches to finish the session off. John had me do those. Dante's a big proponent of that. That's just where you strap weight around your waist and hang from a pull-up bar. And I like to do it. I prefer a neutral grip because it feels better on my foot
Mhm.
than a pronated grip. And dear God, I wouldn't do a supinated grip and the fear of tearing my bicep. But
I
uh,
mean, you could also do that just strapped into a heavier pull down. But I
yes,
think the important thing with that too is a lot of people go too heavy with that.
agreed.
And again, the more weight you put on there, not just from the standpoint of like, okay, it's a lot of traction on the joints.
Yeah.
The more weight you put on there, if you're looking for fascial opening, if you put a lot of weight, your body's gonna move where it's efficient. You're not gonna get the full expansion. So that's why I think going to something like if you were just gonna use a cable station, find the right weight that lets you really get every fiber open where you want it to and go, okay, now I can stay here. Then you're kind of getting the art rather than just like, throwing weight on there and let it hang.
Another cool thing that I like to do there is, did I ever have you do rack chins? I can't remember. I think,
No, but I love
oh,
reactions.
okay, perfect. So if I'm doing a rest pause set of those,
Mm-hmm.
after the last rep where like, or seizuring towards the bar.
Like, yeah, you get the shake going. It's
Yeah.
like the
I,
hack squat too.
yes. Yeah. I like to just sink down into that stretch and breathe into it. So,
Yeah,
it's not heavily loaded. I mean, you have probably what, 60-ish% of your weight plus maybe a 50-pound to a 100-pound easy bar. So it's not your full body weight. And that just lets that lat to me just open up and feel,
the other really good thing, I use that for slinky trainings we have for people at the end of the session too.
yes.
Because again, we train in a way that just shoves our scaps and our rib cage forward. Is that if you can, instead of going more vertical at the angle, take it a little bit more horizontally and let the rib cage just kind of retract and sit back, you
Yeah.
actually offload a lot of that posterior compression that you put on yourself during the session.
Oh, hell yeah. I've never even considered doing that. What's really interesting is I would naturally do that where I'd like hunch over and like just let all that just
That's
open.
exactly, yeah.
Yep. I've never m- more me falling into smart shit and didn't know about it.
It's almost like you're really good at what you do. Weird.
Yeah.
It's almost like doing this for like 20 years makes you really good at it. It's
Weird,
almost like
right?
you with a curious mind going like, huh, I wonder, and just trying shit. It's almost like that's paid off.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. The fear of not failing has worked in my benefit, I think.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding, no kidding.
Fuck it. Like, I guess this is where we'll kind of end it. Like, I think I may have said this on here before. Like, there's no winning and losing. It's winning and learning is how I view that.
Yeah,
You know,
love
like
it.
there's no, in my mind, unless I get hurt, there's no downside to experimentation. Um,
Yeah.
it's only exploration, and that can be positive or negative. Like, hey, I never want to do that again. Or, man, that kind of felt good. Maybe if I tinker around with this a little bit more, I can find something cool out of it. And
I
then,
think,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, and then if I find something cool that I like, I share it with my friends and let them try it, and they'll give me feedback.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Right.
I think there's been, you've probably figured out more great things just by not having a fear of failure and just doing it
Yeah.
than most people will ever. Yeah, I think that's something that you and I really just really believe in for a lot of people is like try something because you and I can talk about, structure and training. We can talk about different cues we like, things like that. But all those things are just starting points
Agreed. Right.
because your ability to execute or like how, like, if we say use a little bit more pinky pressure to drive more supination and you go, okay, when I go full pinky, that doesn't feel good. What if I go here?
Right.
That
Yes.
feels better.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love that, right? Because I think you've heard a lot of bodybuilders say like use the gun grip, right? Tension here, not here. They'll say like use your hand as a hook, and it's like all these different, I think like psychological cues to get people to pull with their back as opposed to other body parts.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess the biggest thing is unless you try them all, how do you know it works? Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna just blindly listen to someone because they have a shitload of more muscle than me. I'm gonna try it. But then if I'm like, well, this kind of actually feels a little bit better, like,
And
yeah,
it's going to change over a training block. Like how many times have you gone in a training block starting with grip one way and then, 12 weeks later you realize you need to change your grip just a little bit. Because we do have these subacute changes that happen that our body's smart. So we got to offload that.
what's funny is like we didn't even in terms of back. And then again, I think this like back is almost too big for a podcast. Like we didn't talk about any things I feel like you and I like we love the Dante row. Why?
We could probably talk about back again next week if
Agreed.
we
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah.
So,
So yeah, we have well exceeded the hour, and that's what I promised you.
no, no, I'm sorry. I had to get up a couple times and had the dog barking and whatnot.
No stress, no stress.
You're
So
excused
that is
today.
I would say about 60% of back. And maybe next time we finish back and we have another cool topic that we might introduce to you guys that you and I spoke about through a text
Mhm.
message today. So yeah, maybe we'll go there next week because we didn't touch on anything upper back. And then there's a
Or
few,
your delts.
right? We didn't do correct, correct. And that's or we should even traps. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't even feel like we fully covered lats. I think we like are scratching the surface on
agreed. Agreed.
back.
All right, so more back next week, and then maybe a new topic if we have time, or yeah, we'll save it for that. Until next time, Chris, Danny, we're done.
Later.